English translation. 572nd contact Saturday, the 5th of October 2013, 14:25 hours.
Your fit of laughter before the correction work also made me laugh, dear friend.
Which was not my intention, but your remark, which sounded so defensive, triggered a burst of laughter in me that not only made you laugh, but also Bernadette. But if you will allow me, I would like to talk about what I asked Florina last night to tell you and Quetzal, because we need to know what to do about donations and gifts and ultimately also about legacies. We have some ideas on this, but we did not come to a conclusion yesterday on how to act, so we would like to hear your and Quetzal's views. I would like to record everything on the computer so that we can have your and Quetzal's opinion read out in the evening.
The rules of conduct are given by the statutes and articles of association. They must be observed and may not be bent or broken.
This is of course clear to us, but nevertheless questions arise, which I had Florina pass on to you. So if you could please answer them by telling us how you and Quetzal see the whole thing. For my part, I am thinking of the cults that suck the blood of their believers financially and steal every last button of their trousers. So it should not be allowed, either in the core group or in the national and study groups, that members are gutted down to their shirts by donations or gifts. Consequently, I think that major financial donations should be controlled in such a way that the persons who make major donations or gifts are asked about their financial situation, whether they can afford it. The core group has set a maximum amount of CHF 2,500 for donations and gifts, although it is not clear to us for what period this amount is to apply, or whether such an amount may be donated every month or only every 3, 6, or 12 months. The actual reasonable proposal is for 1 year for people on normal incomes who have a good average annual salary. I do not think there should be any more than that, because otherwise, that is how I see it. The whole thing is already tantamount to exploitation.
That is correct. CHF 2,500 should be a maximum amount calculated for a year for normally paid persons, whereby their annual wage corresponds to a normal average annual wage, as statistically determined in each country.
According to the statistics, an average monthly wage of CHF 4,500 is given for Switzerland. But what should we do if the average wage is below this amount? Should we simply make sure that when donations are made, the maximum amount is simply correspondingly lower?
Yes, common sense says so. In this form, it can certainly be done in a legal way.
And how are we to handle it if larger donations and gifts are made by people who have demonstrably larger assets and/or a correspondingly higher income?
Basically, the statutes stipulate that larger donations and gifts, as well as legacies, must be made to the core group, Sim-Ya-Se Silver Star Center, Mutter Center, Hinter Schmidruti 1225, 8495 Schmidruti, Switzerland. In special cases of larger donations or gifts, care must be taken to ensure that these are proportionate to the larger average annual income and/or assets, and that the donation or gift does not cause difficulties for the donors and donors. It is also important to ensure that donors and givers do not incur any financial expenditure.
And what about when a national group or study group accumulates assets?
An accumulation of assets should not be allowed, but if assets do arise, then the rules of the statutes apply that the capital should be transferred to the administration of the core group of the Sim-Ya-Se Silver Star Center, Mother Center, Hinter Schmidruti 1225, 8495 Schmidruti, Switzerland.
What about working capital for the national and study groups?
What do you mean by this?
By this I mean financial resources that should be available to the respective group to pay for running costs, etc. in self-administration and self-management. In other words, a certain amount of cash capital, which they can freely determine and dispose of according to common group decisions.
That is, of course, how it should be, but a certain amount of money should be predetermined and a corresponding bank account should be kept. which has to be administered by the group itself, over which 3 persons with collective signatures have to sign, and each of them only according to an overall group decision.
Calculated in Swiss francs, would a sum of CHF 25,000 be appropriate for a national group and CHF 5,000 for a study group?
That would be a considerable amount of money, but I think it could be appropriate. A, the condition must be that a decisive overall group control is exercised over it and that the capital is not used inappropriately, nor is it used for private purposes. B, if one amount exceeds CHF 5,000 or CHF 25,000, then any additional amount is to be paid to the core group, Simjase Silver Star Center, Mutter Center, Hinter Schmidruti 1225, 8,495 Schmidruti, Switzerland. This must be absolutely essential so that no national or study group is enriched at the expense of members and sponsors, etc., as is the case worldwide with all esoteric and religious sects, and occasionally also with other dubious groups.
Well, what should we do if there are donations or gifts from people who are deserving or wealthy enough to be able to donate or give larger sums for certain projects, or perhaps leave them by bequest?
In this regard, for larger donations, gifts, and legacies, it is stipulated in the statutes that such financial means may only be directed to the core group of the 49 Simjase Silver Star Center, Mutter Center, Hinter Schmidruti 1225, 8,495 Schmidruti, Switzerland, which administers the accruing capital and determines what purpose it is to serve. However, the following is to be said on several points in an expanded form. 1. If certain projects are involved, such as translations and book printing, like a clubhouse, etc., then donations and gifts in amounts greater than CHF 2,500 per month or year may be considered. But for this purpose, it must be ensured on the one hand that the donors or givers do not fall into financial hardship, and on the other hand that the amounts collected for such projects are deposited in a special bank account. However, the project amount should be respected and not exceeded. The account, which must therefore be opened at a bank, must be under the control of the relevant overall group, with 3 persons in the collective signing for it. And it must be guaranteed on a group basis that the funds in such an account will be used exclusively for the intended purpose. 2. In repetition of what has been said, larger donations, gifts, and legacies may only be made to the core group FIGU, Mother Center, Simjase Silver Star Center, Hinter Schmidruti 1225, 8,495 Schmidruti, Switzerland, which manages the incoming financial means for the FIGU National Group or FIGU Study Group concerned and decides which projects, etc., will be financed by them. A. If a bank account is to be opened by a national group or study group, in the context of translations, book printing, or a club building, then the core group of the 49 Simjase Silver Star Center, Mutter Center, Hinter Schmidruti 1225, 8,495 Schmidruti, Switzerland, should grant a special permission for this. This must be done so that the individual national and study groups do not accumulate nonsensical finances and do not exploit their members through donations and gifts or through later legacies, thereby accumulating assets. Just as they cannot misuse donations, gifts, and legacies, as is unfortunately done elsewhere in all cults, whereby as a rule the leaders of cults also benefit financially from everything. 3. Larger donations and gifts for specific projects should and may only be accepted by donors and givers if it can be proved that they do not get into financial distress as a result of the donations or gifts, and are also not harmed in any other way. 4. The statutes also state that no FIGU grouping may incur debts in any way, but that things of whatever nature which arise may only be discussed and put into practice when sufficient financial means are available. Excluded from this are mortgages for the purchase of association property in relatively good standing, but a mortgage should never exceed an amount which is higher than 1/5 of a purchase price of the property. This is what we have learned from you, although this impressive rule seems to us to be extremely valuable. Therefore, it should be respected by all FIGU groups.
This must never be allowed to become apparent, but it does require that the core group exercises decisive control in this respect. When I think of sex, which also includes other groups that take money out of the pockets of their believers or other supporters who are friendly to them, often until they have no money at all, and may even kill themselves because of it, I am terrified. Such a thing must never happen in FIGU, but it must be the opposite, so that every member of our association group can live and budget reasonably. Consequently, each member must also be responsible for the other there and to the extent necessary, and this must also be the case for the whole group, so that no one suffers hardship, does not fall into misery, and also does not fall into debt, etc. The principle must simply prevail, one for all and all for one. Only within this framework can a true community exist and be evolving and progressive, honorable and worthy.
This is unquestionable and of the utmost importance.
Correct, but there's one question that comes to mind before I forget. I was talking to Barbara and Andreas the other day, and surrealism is an example that came to my mind. Here's what I understand. Surrealism is a movement that has found its way into literature and painting as well as films and photography, and this strange trend originated in Paris around 1920. Of course, the term also originates from the French language and is composed of the word sur, about, and réalisme, realism, reality. So the word in German actually means Überwirklichkeit, that is to say something that is above reality and is more than fantastic or has nothing to do with reality. Surrealism is therefore based on something completely imaginary, imagined, illusory, deceptive, and on something strange and utopian, unreal, intangible, and unreal. In my opinion, the whole thing has nothing to do with fantasy. What is your opinion?
Surrealism really has nothing to do with fantasy, but with pathologically unreal and imaginative, illusory ideas, which in a certain sense show unreal forms of delusional structures. The whole of surrealism thus corresponds to something unreal, confused and erroneously alien to reality, which is a sign that the human being, who is temporarily or permanently addicted to surrealism, lives in a completely abnormal world of thoughts and feelings, which he cannot reconcile with reality and thus behaves towards it in one of the many forms of outsiderhood. This corresponds to a certain pathologically absurd, confused thought behavior, which cannot be reconciled with a really healthy combination of real ideas about reality. With regard to the human beings who create surrealistic things, such as so-called works of art, etc., or who are also only temporarily addicted to surrealistic ideas, they are unstable with regard to reality, and therefore, at least in certain moments, openly break through a certain unreal and unworldly reality and unfamiliarity with the world in terms of ideas, thoughts, and imagination.
Does that also exist with you?
No, this phenomenon is only known to us from Earth.
Imagination can also be incorporated into purely futuristic ideas and works, but I do not see surrealism in them.
Imagination, whatever its form, has nothing to do with surrealism, but is always formed in a way of reality or in something that can become reality. If, for example, utopian things and works, etc., are conceived, designed, or produced, they always have features that correspond to reality or can become reality.
Human beings who think surrealistically, etc., how is their ratio to reality to be judged?
The human beings who think surrealistically and create things are normal human beings, but there is a conscious deficiency in their ability to imagine in terms of a healthy imagination and reality. These are out of touch with reality, although this state can be temporary or also permanent and can take on schizophrenic forms.
So surrealists are actually normal human beings in terms of their understanding and reasoning. But the human being's consciousness is temporarily or permanently freaked out in relation to ideas, which is pathological if it lasts. But what about the dreams that occur in a surreal way, as is said? For my part, I have never had surrealistic dreams.
The more reality and truth connected the human being is, the more realistically he dreams and thinks too, whereby fantastic and utopian appearances can also be woven in, but never surrealistic images.
Does this mean that the human being whose consciousness, mind, and reason function correctly cannot have surrealistic dreams?
That is correct. Surrealism is based on a dysfunction of consciousness. Mind and reason, and in a permanent state of consciousness, mind and reason, there is usually a pathological form of alienation from reality up to schizophrenia.
Steep, really steep. But look here, I took this from the internet, where you can read about surrealism among other things, which I find a bit banal and factually incorrect when I compare it with your explanation.
What is surrealism?
Melting clocks in a barren lunar landscape, elephants with spider legs, fish eating tigers. We encounter strange things in the paintings of the surrealist painter Salvador Dali. They seem strange and unreal to the viewer, surreal, like pictures in a dream. The aim of the surrealists was to create a superordinate reality that goes beyond what we see and also includes the unconscious and dreamlike. In their works of art, they wanted to represent not only what we see and know, but also dreams, visions, the unreal and the fantastic. They were guided by spontaneous feelings and moods. To suspend the laws of logic and reason, the surrealists invented the technique of spontaneous painting, or writing automatism. New painting and writing techniques, automatism, frottage, grattage. Here the artist only follows his spontaneous inspiration when he puts words or colors on paper so that the unconscious can express itself without control by the mind. Associations, images, and thoughts that arise during the work should flow into the artwork unfiltered. The surrealists also ventured into new pictorial forms and techniques. Thus, the painter Max Ernst developed the techniques of frottage and grattage. In frottage, paper is placed on a structured surface, such as wood. Afterwards, the grain is rubbed through the paper with a soft pencil. In frottage, the artist applies the paint in several layers on top of each other and then scrapes it off the canvas to create new color patterns. The collage that Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso had developed in 1911 twelfths was also popular. Here, different materials, such as pieces of paper, pieces of wallpaper, fabric, wood or wire, are processed and glued together to form a picture.
Representative of Surrealism.
Surrealism in France was founded by a group of artists, which included French writers such as André Breton, Paul Éluard, and Louis Aragon, as well as the German painter Max Ernst. In 1924, Breton published the Manifesto of Surrealism, in which he presented the new movement in art. A first exhibition of surrealist art took place in Paris in 1925. Among the artists represented there were also Pablo Picasso, Paul Klee, and Man Ray, who became famous as a photographer. In surrealist painting, one can distinguish two styles. Painters like Salvador Dali or René Magritte depicted things and forms that did not belong together in a naturalistic environment. Others like Joan Moreau painted completely abstract. Surrealism was a worldwide movement. Surrealist groups of artists formed in many European countries. After the Second World War, painters like Dali and Max Ernst also made surrealism known in America.
Precursors of Surrealism.
the Surrealists drew inspiration from German Romanticism. Romantic poets such as Novalis also sought a new approach to reality and incorporated the dreamlike, the unreal, and the unconscious into their works. The direct precursor of Surrealism is Dadaism. Founded in 1916 in Zurich, Dadaism had a great impact on contemporary artists. The origin of the term is unclear. The French word dada means hobbyhorse, but dada could also simply be taken from the language of babies. For the word stands for childishness, originality, and a return to the beginnings of culture. Dadaist artists rebelled against everything that existed, against society, against tradition, against a world determined by reason and logic. They also did not want to establish a new art movement with new rules. Their aim was to give the playful and absurd, the accidental and arbitrary a place in art.